never hired me to be a reporter or an editor when we were at the paper.
Well, I don't remember ever seeing you, Mark.
So the book is fantastic, and it's a very, I think, for somebody who was involved in a very kind of even-handed account of everything that happened. A key thesis of the book, and I'm going to quote from it, is the internet and declining circulations didn't kill newspapers any more than long stories, skimpy attention spans, or arrogant journalists did. What is killing a system that brings reliably edited news and information to readers' doorsteps every morning, I'm going to read the whole book, for less than a cup of coffee is the way the people who have run the industry have reacted to those forces. So obviously the whole book it gets into all of that, but give us a real kind of snapshot of how the forces have reacted in a way that you think has kind of really hurt journalism.
Well, I think in the early part of say in the 90s, when the internet really starts coming along, instead of sitting down and saying, okay, here's a new force, and how does this newspaper fit into this force, and how can we get along with this, and how can we generate the revenue we need to pay? These guys would sit around and say, well, let's see if we can buy each other. And I'm going to go out and buy this company and buy that company, because it was a lot easier for them to sell a full-page ad in a newspaper than to go out and get 10,000 more readers. It was cheaper and easier to do, and that's what they did. So I think it was easy to do that. It was much easier to pay Wall Street a lot of money and dividends and in returns than invest in journalism and expand papers and create content that people really wanted to read. And so that's what they did. They did what really basically led to big earnings, and which led to, the newspaper industry during the 90s was incredibly profitable. It was a money machine. And so the people who were running it got big bonuses, and they got stock options and all those sorts of things. It's very much it's a Wall Street kind of a phenomenon. And so that's what they did. And that was the easiest thing to do. And that's how they reacted to these forces.
Now, what about the counter argument that a paper like the New York Times, which has seemed to maintain its commitment to foreign bureaus and really a commitment to doing what it's always done, still has been in a kind of a uncomfortable position where they've had to lay off people, where they've lost money. So how does the argument work for them? Is it possible that the classified ads going away and the internet, people reading stuff for free, there's nothing you could do?
Well, there are things that you could have done. I mean, all the way back into the 80s, there were people that said, we're too reliant on advertising. We should begin investing in content, and that's what the New York Times does. I mean, right now, the New York Times is not in bankruptcy. The Chicago Tribune and the LA Times are in bankruptcy court.
Good point. So let's go back to your beginnings at the Tribune. You get there in 1979. Right. Paint a picture of what the Tribune was. Had it moved on from its reputation as Colonel McCormick's paper, the isolationist, agenda-driven paper?
Yes, it had. There was a fellow named Clayton Kirkpatrick who had become the editor, and the Colonel was famous because he tried to rewrite the language in his own way. So he would, instead of spelling though, T-H-O-U-G-H, he would spell it T-H-O. Yeah. And he would, like freight. I have in a book where at one time I'm leaving the Tribune, and it's 1980, and I look up at the elevator, it's the freight elevator, and it's got up above it, F-R-A-T-E. and so he was kind of a real character. And Clayton Kirkpatrick came along and said, we have to change this, because they were losing money, and they were losing advertising, they were losing readers. And it's almost like turning.
Were pissed off by the spelling?
Yeah, it was the Colonel's. Yeah. They were kind of crazy. I mean, the Colonel one time, he was a real character, and I didn't even get into this in the book. But one time, he had a farm out in Wheaton, which is now called Cantini, and he experimented around with farm, all the crops and all that. So you'd get these weird stories in the Tribune about how many times does a chicken lay an egg with 3 yolks, and stuff like that. And so he had all these editors in, and he has them up he had his office at the top of Tribune Tower, and it's a huge, massive, beautiful office. And he had them all in there, and he had a big table, and they all come in, and they sit down, and he serves them this wonderful dinner. And after they're done eating the dinner, he says, do you know what you gentlemen just ate? And they all kind of look at each other and said, no. He says, you just ate crow, which I thought was a pretty appropriate dish
Yeah.
for a group of editors.
Yeah.
And he had this crazy belief that if you could turn crow into a good bird to eat,
And it sounds
and
like,
then you
it
wouldn't
sounds
be,
like he was right.
yeah, and you wouldn't have him messing around in your crop fields.
To his credit, though, he never, to our knowledge, was like Randy Michaels, blown on the 24th floor.
No. 22nd floor.
20, sorry. So in 1984, you write in the book, that was the height of newspaper circulation in this country.
Right.
64 million people were getting the newspaper. When, at least for the Tribune Company, did things start to begin to go awry?
That was really in the late 90s. I mean, throughout the 90s, the Tribune was the most successful newspaper company in the country.
Really?
Yes, the Chicago Tribune particularly, it generated oodles of cash. And they started, really was the first newspaper to adopt an internet edition. It started a local cable television station here. It made a ton of money. And then, in fact, they were one of the early investors in America Online. And that they took I think it was a $5 million investment. No, it wasn't. It was more than that. It was $20 million. They invested in AOL very early on, and in 1999, they sold that for $1.2 billion.
Wow.
And they used that $1.2 billion to go out and buy the Los Angeles Times. And it wasn't just the Los Angeles Times. It was the Baltimore Sun, the Los Angeles Times, the Hartford Courant. And it turned the Tribune from a Chicago company with some local properties and a couple of papers down in Florida into a company that owned 13 newspapers. It owned at that point about 23 television stations, and it could reach 38 million people in this country. It was huge.
So the conventional wisdom has been that deal, particularly because of the fines that had been levied against the LA Times that the Tribune learned later that it inherited, that was the beginning of some really rough times for the Tribune Company.
I kind of talk about it in there. I said, this final deal where they sold out to Sam Zell was the deal from hell. But the Tribune made a stop in purgatory first when they bought the Times-Mirror Company. And that's when the troubles really started.
But so my question, I guess, is what happened initially was there might have been some arrogance from the corporate side in Chicago toward LA. And then certainly there were people in the LA newsroom who said, hey, we don't want to deal at all with these Chicago local yokel kind of guys.
Right.
But had attitudes been different, had there been a real sense of cooperation and, hey, we can really make something wonderful out of this, could that merger, or I guess takeover really is what it was, could that have succeeded? It
could have succeeded more than it did. I think inevitably it wasn't the merger, it was this lack of investment in newspapers. It was this failure to diversify your revenue stream so that you got so much money coming from circulation. In fact, like the Los Angeles Times, it did have a diversified revenue stream. And then in the 90s, Wall Street basically said, we don't like it like that. We like it to be clear and simple. And they sold off all of the assets that they could have had that would diversify their revenue base so that if a downturn comes in advertising, you got income from somewhere else. But by the time you get into the 2000s, 80 to 90% of our revenue is coming from advertising, and only a small amount is coming from circulation. And so when the internet comes along and makes it better, easier, cheaper, and more efficient to advertise, and the revenue started going out the door, they had conditioned everybody to receive the newspaper for like 50 to 60 cents. And to raise it, you would get circulation losses, and they were just kind of screwed.
Now, one of the big things the Tribune Company tried to do, there was a lot of talk with we own all these different properties, was obviously synergy. That was a big buzzword. Yeah. And the idea was, okay, if there are 5 people covering the war in Afghanistan, and they're all covering the same war, and they all belong to the same company, wouldn't it make sense to get rid of 4 of them, have 1 person cover the war, and maybe reallocate those resources, either get rid of those resources because we're losing money, or reallocate them to local coverage? And you've got a big kind of problem with that. And I want to just kind of talk about how do you, and I agree with you to a large extent, but but how do you deal with losing revenue and maintain the same numbers and the same amount of people kind of flooding
Well, you
the
know,
zone?
I mean, I think we did do a lot of that. We did say, okay, we don't need 4 people covering the war in Afghanistan. But, you know, to me, the important thing is the story in a newspaper should be originated by an editor that lives in the city where the newspaper's published. So if I'm sitting in Chicago and I want a story out of Afghanistan and I want a particular story that I think is relevant to my readers, I can't call the Los Angeles Times and say, would you do it for me? They aren't, because there's an editor out there that has other priorities. So you can save money. I mean, and it was common sense to save some money, and but that wasn't the problem. I mean, we could have cut down to 1 person. That wasn't going to stop. That wasn't a game-changing strategy for these papers, because you could save a few bucks, but it really, you know, the thing that I think a lot of people don't realize is a newspaper's greatest cost is not the editorial part. The editorial part typically accounts for 10 to 15% of your revenues. At the most, 15% is high. Mm-hmm. When I was the managing editor of the Chicago Tribune, I think our editorial budget represented about 11% of our revenue. In the LA Times, it was about 13%. So the big cost is producing the paper and delivering it to your doorstep. That's what costs all the money. It's the printing plant, the trucks, the drivers. That's what costs all the money. And so you can play around with your editorial expenses and you can cut down a few people, but that's crazy, because you're cutting down the very thing that that's what you got. That's your journalism, and that is what's important. And you have that, and that's what you can deliver to people. That's really the important part of what you do. So why cut that? So you can look at, and I think what happened with the Tribune is they were very efficient. They got rid of a lot of costs out of a manufacturing process, but at some point, those savings stop, because you still have to produce the paper, get it on a truck, pay for the gasoline, print it, ink, paper, delivered to your doorstep. And that's a fixed cost, and it's very difficult for you to lower that after a certain point.
So you made these same arguments because you were in a position as managing editor and then editor-in-chief to talk to the real powers that be, and you would make these arguments. And what were the responses that you would get?
Well, people would say to you, "Oh, you're just a dreamer," or you just want to spend your way out of
What's
this.
wrong with being a dreamer?
and eventually they say, "Well, we're going to give you a great opportunity to spend some more time with your family," which is what they did. But I mean, most of the people, didn't. Everybody really thought this would go on forever. That this little downturn's another downturn in the economy. Pretty soon advertising will come back. And it was a fundamental change in the industry that no one woke up to.
So are we at a point now of no return, or do you believe that, and the Tribune has started doing that. They've made their I know they laid off a few people recently, but they also increased the size of their print package. Could the Tribune, could the LA Times recapture what you believe has been lost?
Possibly, but they're not going to do it with a print newspaper.
Okay.
Because you have a fundamental problem here. You're delivering something to somebody's door at a cost that exceeds what you're getting for it.
Now you pull no punches in the book. One of the people who comes under attack is the current editor of the Tribune, Jerry Kern. You call him Count Kern because he was busy counting the number of journalists writing how many stories they were writing. Was this book, has there been burning of bridges because of this book? And what were those bridges?
Well, bridges were burned long ago, I think. But, I guess this wasn't like I didn't have an axe to grind. I really didn't. I got fired. Okay. I thought I was doing the right thing. Somebody that fired me thought they were doing the right thing. Let's move on. I'm all for that. And I mean, the reason I wrote it was two reasons. One is they pissed me off. And they didn't piss me off by firing me. After I got fired, they owed me some money. Not a lot. Probably at the most, we were looking at, 50, 60 grand difference between the two of us. And they say, okay, we'll pay you. But first, you have to sign a non-disparagement agreement.
Wow.
And I said,
opposite of what a journalism.
Yeah, and I'm saying, now wait a minute. This is a company that has a museum on Michigan Avenue. It's a freedom of speech museum.
I I think isn't it an Argo-T now or something?
Well,
like
yeah, it's I don't know. Or it's something like that. And so, and I said, no, I'm not going to sign that. I don't. And they said, well, you know, if you go to, I went to a lawyer, and he said, well, you go to court. He said, I'll guarantee you're going to win, but you will spend more money paying me than you're going to get out of this, and so you might as well just sign it. And I said, you know, I don't really give a damn. I'm not going to sign it. I'm a journalist. I don't sign things like that. So then I started thinking about it. And then a friend called me, and he says, you know, you're one of the few people that wouldn't sign these things. You got to write a book about what happened, because most people, you know, you can't get, they can't do that. And and it wasn't my motive. I thought, you know, if I do care about journalism, and I care about these newspapers, and I wanted to see how they could survive. And I started thinking, if I had to write a newspaper series or a book about this, do I really know what happened? And I decided I didn't. So I thought, I'm going to go back and I'm going to report what happened. And I'm not going to try to settle scores or anything. I'm just going to say what happened. And I'm in it, of course, but also I'm going to do that because I can. I was an insider. I saw the whole thing, but and I'm not going to let somebody tell me what I can and can't say. And so that really kind of motivated me to write the book, and that's. So I set out to do that, and it wasn't I wasn't trying to get even with anybody or anything like that. I was just trying to say, this is what happened, because if you can figure out how you got into this mess, maybe, just maybe, you can figure out how you can get out of it.
Now, if you were the editor of the LA Times, and somebody said, I want to write a story about what happened, and you said, well, you might say you can't because you were there. That's not objective reporting. So how do you get around the criticism that you can't write a fair account of everything that happened because you were so involved in it?
Well, because probably in my book, my experience is about 15% of it. 85% of it is reported. If you look in the notes in the back of it, you can figure out how I got everything. And I mean, I think the answer is just good old-fashioned reporting. You just go out and you ask questions. I didn't, every meeting or something that I reported on, I either experienced it, I would call people back and say, this is how I remember it. Is this what you remember? And to double check my own memory, which you discover when you're writing a book like this isn't as good as you think it is. And you just, you know, so I think it's the answer to that is I can do that because I'm a reporter. And I'm not telling my story. I'm telling what happened. And I'm doing it as a reporter. I'm using documents. I'm using interviews. I'm going back and I'm talking to people. Like in one part of the book, you know, there was this big circulation fraud scandal in Newsday. I thought I knew what had happened, but then when I started reporting, I thought, Jesus, this is a hell of a story, and I didn't know what it was about. And I went to Long Island, and I interviewed all the people, and I you know, put it in the book. I laid out the whole story of what happened, and then I discovered in the process that there had been a similar one in a similar kind of misstatement of circulation in Los Angeles right before I got there, and they had, you know, basically had been covered up, and no one ever really knew about it. So I mean, I think it's that kind of reporting and that just dogged going after your question and answering your questions that says, okay, this is not some guy piping off about what, you know, what happened. Oh, look what happened to me. You know, that's not that. It is a reported book.
That could be a good book, though.
Yeah, but this is a reported book that says, okay, here is what happened. And, you know, I'm sure there are people that are furious at me. I know, in fact, I know that. but you know, my point wasn't to make anybody happy, and it wasn't to make friends or make enemies. My point was to say, okay, this is what happened, so that years later, when someone comes along and says, Jesus, how'd the whole newspaper industry fall apart? You got the account right there. And it's not, and you look in those footnotes, and you can see where I got everything.
There are so many good reporters and editors still at the Tribune, especially the guy who spots me when I'm lifting. Is there still a paper that you appreciate? Forget the people who run it, forget the corporate, but is there times when you say, God, I love that paper. It was part of my life for so long, and they're still doing some great stuff.
There are reporters that are doing great journalism, but I think the journalism that I see today is episodic rather than systematic. I mean, you know, you used to have people systematically examining things. The Chicago Tribune I'm proud to say when I was managing editor, wrote a seminal series on the death penalty.
Steve Mills
and Maury Posley and Ken Armstrong. That basically, it changed the entire debate over the death penalty in this whole country. And that was a systematic, those guys, we spent 5 years constantly. We looked at the death penalty, we looked at cops and confessions, we looked at how, all of the kind of stuff you see on TV about the forensics and all that. We did a big series about how that really, there were a lot of mistakes in that. And that was really systematic, dedicated coverage. Nobody was going to say, oh, I want to get an ad so I can put it next to a story about somebody getting hung, wrongly prosecuted and hung.
Like J.C.
Nobody
Penney.
wants to do that, right? But today there's still good stories, but I don't see that systematic dedication. And I think it's partially because they're under a lot of strain, and there are a lot of people. I mean, there are really good reporters still at the Tribune. And they're friends of mine, and even if I'm not standing on Michigan Avenue, they'll even walk up and say hi. but
you can go over, have some tea.
Yeah. But it's not the same. It's not the same kind of systematic. Like I say, the real kind of real dedication. Because when I was managing editor of the Tribune, at one point I had a little over 700 journalists working in my newsroom. I'll bet you, I don't know what their number is now, but I'd bet it's under 400.
Yeah.
I know in the LA Times, when I left the LA Times, we had 940 journalists working in the newsroom. And I know today that's about 550, down from that. Now, you can still put out a good newspaper with 550 journalists, but you can't put out the kind of newspaper that we were putting out when we had 900, and we had people all over the world, and we had people that would really, answer a question. And I'll give you a good example of the impact that can have. When Barack Obama was running for president, and I remember it was Fox News put out a story that he had been educated in a madrasa in Indonesia when he was growing up. And I was editor of the LA Times. And I said, well, wait a minute. Let's go to Indonesia and let's find out did he go to a madrasa? What did he do? Where did he go to school? So you take a reporter and you go over there, and this is an editor in Los Angeles, California, saying, I want to use somebody to go find out if that's true. Now, somebody sitting in Chicago may not care about that. They should, because it's Barack Obama. But that's what I'm saying. And so we did, and we found out that was absolutely untrue. And even the Obama campaign got mad at us. David Axelrod called me up and was yelling at me, saying, "Why do you continue writing about this?" And I said, "Well, we're writing a story about what happened. He didn't go to a madrasa. This was a school. It was a Muslim country, and it was a private school in a Muslim country."
Why would Axelrod be upset about it? Because you were keeping the conversation
going?
Yeah,
because we kept it going. He said, "Well, every time you write about it, then Fox News rises up again." So it was that kind of journalism. I don't think is going on as it used to, and it's not, and it's expensive, and it's going to continue to decline. And I mean, until somebody figures out a way to finance it, and that's really what we're doing at the Chicago News Cooperative. We're experimenting around with how are we going to pay for the kind of journalism you need in a society, because it's going. And it's gonna continue to go, because you basically got an uneconomic industry, and it's gonna. So we're trying to figure out what will people pay for, and and part of it is we just weren't producing content that was good enough, and we have to get better at that, and we have to go out. And so right now we're kind of dependent on charity, and we get donations from foundations and individuals to help us. But our goal is over 5 years to become self-sustaining, so that we can generate. We don't want to generate a huge profit. We just want to generate enough money to pay reporters to go cover City Hall and the schools, the county building, and all other places. I mean, go cover the foreclosure crisis. Nobody's covering it. And so those are the kinds of things that I feel are important, and that we have to go start covering.
Well, I really enjoy reading the Chicago News Cooperative, and I really enjoyed this book.
Oh, good.
And thank you for coming. The Deal from Hell, it's for sale out there. James O'Shea.